And all right. So we are live and we are recording. So hello, everyone. My name is Kevin, and I'm from the Thompson-Nicola Regional Library, here to welcome you tonight to the Author Talk with Iona Whishaw, and in partnership with the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts. Tonight, we welcome JP Baker from the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts, as well as the author Iona Whishaw. I have a couple of quick announcements before I turn host duties over. If you can't stay with us for the whole event, it will be recorded and it will be available later on our YouTube channel as well as Facebook page. If you've joined us on Zoom, we're keeping the video and the microphone off, but you can ask questions or give comments through the chat function. And if you are watching on YouTube Live or otherwise, feel free to type comments into the comments section and we'll relay them so that they can be asked as questions. I'll be monitoring that and we'll pass them on to JP to be asked. Make sure that Iona gets the questions in the Q&A period. If you're on Zoom, you can definitely put them right into the chat. So without further ado, I'll pass the presentation over to JP.
So much, Kevin. It's a real pleasure for us at the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts to partner with our local library system on amazing events like this one. We've been able to host many amazing authors and have a chance to learn from them over the past year, so that's wonderful. I'd like to take a second to acknowledge off the bat here that we are the hosts of this event, are here joining you from the traditional, unceded and ancestral territory of the Kamloops to Secwepemc, in what you will see on many maps as Kamloops. It's an honor to live as a guest on this land, and I encourage you all to think about the territory that you are joining us from and the people who have stewarded that territory for thousands of years. So thank you. I'm with the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts. We promote the written arts throughout our region. And it's a great pleasure this evening to welcome Iona Whishaw to our virtual meeting space here. Iona has quite an interesting and diverse background. She has worked as a youth worker, a social worker, a teacher, and most famously, I think, as a school principal, for which she has won awards, as well as a Women of Distinction in Education Award by the YWCA in 2010. So certainly a distinguished educator, but also an accomplished writer, and has written in several different genres. I love the title of her children's book, Henry and the Cow Problem. She has also written the Lane Winslow Mystery Series, and I think that that's probably what she might talk most about this evening. She has grown up in several different places, which I'm sure have informed her diverse interests, which include other arts as well as besides writing. She is a dancer and a painter, and I understand she sings as well. I'm not going to put her on the spot and ask her to do that this evening, but I will encourage her to speak about her books and her writing, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. I will leave my camera on so that she doesn't have to speak only to some names on the screen, but please direct your attention to Iona and give her a rousing virtual welcome. Iona, over to you.
Thank you very much, JP. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And if I may say, I am delighted to live on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And like you, I feel happy to be here. I have a book that just came out in April. So I thought what I'd maybe do is just kick off with a little reading from that book and maybe discuss how this book came to be. When it's time to ask questions, you can ask questions about anything at all with regard to my writing. I'm very happy to answer everything, and I've always had fascinating questions, and you will see that my interaction with readers actually has a big impact on my writing. So I'm happy to talk about that as well. So in this particular book, if you've been a Lane Winslow follower, then you know that Lane is always the one to find the body, and her inspector, now husband, is always the one to go, oh God, not again. And so what's happened here is that the teacher at the local one-room schoolhouse has not turned up for work, and Lane begins to become worried that something's wrong because she can't be reached on the telephone. So she rushes down to the teacher cottage and finds the teacher, the apartment absolutely trashed, not apartment, the little cottage absolutely trashed, and the teacher near death, lying on the ground. And so she has to, the telephone is ripped out of the wall. She doesn't know if any of the nearby neighbors, which would be very hard to get to, she'd have to get in her car and drive back up and over and see if they had a telephone. It would all take a long time. So she's resolved to somehow get the woman into her car and drive her through the snow, because it's also during a very heavy snowfall time. I don't know why I brought out a snow book in the middle of April, but there you go. And she's delivered the woman to the hospital, and now she's going to the police station to talk about what's happened. So that's where we come in. Lane has gone upstairs to Darling's office. Lane found both Sergeant Ames and Inspector Darling in Darling's office, conferring over a document that lay between them on the desk. Ames leapt up at her knock, smiling happily. Miss Winslow, good morning. He consulted his watch. It's gone afternoon. Good afternoon. Darling rolled his eyes. Ames was an absolute slave to his wife. He wondered if Ames would ever get over his eager puppy reaction whenever he saw her. He too rose and said, Ames was just leaving. Do sit down. I was actually just leaving, I mean. With what could almost be a slight bow, Ames left them. You know, you shouldn't come around getting him all riled up like that. It'll take all afternoon for him to settle back to work. Darling waved at the empty chair and sat down himself, an expression of concern settling on his face. Why on earth have you driven all the way to town in this? Not that I'm not ecstatic to see you. It's been all lost dogs around here. Lane sat, putting her handbag on the floor beside her. I'm sorry, darling, but something has rather happened. Rather happened? By the expression on your face, I'd have said it was worse than that. I do so hope you've not come to tell me someone has turned up dead. Not quite dead, no. It's Miss Scott, the retiring teacher from the Balfour School. I went down to the teacher's cottage to see if everything was all right. No one turned up to teach today, you see, and I found Miss Scott collapsed on the floor, the cottage ransacked. Oh, and of course, Miss Keeling, the new teacher, gone, or at least not there. There was no car, and I'm pretty sure Miss Scott had a car. Now, I wonder if Miss Keeling went for help. Lane shook her head, realizing at once that the lack of tracks or footsteps on the new snow made that less likely. Then where was Miss Keeling? Anyway, I took her to the hospital here because their phone line had been cut and she'd passed out, and I didn't think there would be time for me to go running around looking for someone with the phone to get the ambulance up the lake. Lane knew she was sounding a little garbled. I'm sorry. I'm speaking in a jumble. I'm quite flustered, poor Miss Scott. I do hope she's all right. It's hard to believe that such a beautiful woman could be such a harbinger of misfortune, Darling sighed. He got up and went to the door. Ames, get in here and bring a chair and your notebook. He sat and looked at his wife, his head tilted. He said almost to himself, what an appalling thing to happen. Poor Miss Scott. He shook his head. You know, you are fulfilling every exaggerated complaint I make. First, you're producing a serious crime just as lunchtime is approaching. Destroying one of the bright spots of the day, and you're here about a nearly dead person. With your track record, the poor woman has probably died on the operating table by now. Don't be silly, darling. So that's from the early part of A Lethal Lesson. And this book concerns some teachers, obviously. And, I got the idea because in one of my earlier books, I get many wonderful fan letters, many of them, by the way, pointing out errors in the book, like typos or using the wrong name. And actually, if you're inclined to do that, that's very, very helpful, because we get those to the publisher right away to fix them. But most of them are just people who are happy to have read the books. And one of them was a retired historian, and she and I, took up a correspondence about various things. And she wanted to tell me initially that she sort of liked the way the time period I was reflecting seemed quite accurate in the, through the language and the descriptions and so on in the book. And somehow we got onto the subject of one-room schoolhouses. And she happened to have quite a lot of good academic information about, one-room schoolhouses, rural schoolhouses in Canada, because it was a really big feature of a rural environment. And no doubt wherever you are, if it's a small enough community, had or has a one-room schoolhouse. Had, in the sense that maybe no one's attending there, but I know the last group I spoke to, they had one preserved in a museum-like way from their earlier history. So I got the idea that it would be fun to write a book around the lives of the people who taught in these schoolhouses, because they were often very young. They only had to go to normal school to get their training in the early years. My own mother-in-law was a one-room schoolhouse teacher in Saskatchewan, and I have a lovely picture of her, with her graduating class, and she can't have been more than 18 years old. And it turned out, I was talking to my brother, and it turned out he's almost a decade older than I am. And it turned out that he himself had attended the Balfour one-room schoolhouse. And he remembered it incredibly fondly, because the teacher there was extremely kind. And this really piqued my interest, because I'm interested in kind teachers to start with, just from my old professional days. So that was really the impetus for the book. And, the other thing that was interesting to me is Darling and Lane have just returned from their honeymoon a couple of months earlier. So they've only been married a short time. And I do get questions about that, one of the questions being, should you have married them off so early? I don't think 7 or 8 books is that early. But in terms of the period of time I'm covering, yes, I mean, there's absolute mayhem in this community. I read about everyone's dying. So we've had lots of mysteries. And what I was very interested in seeing is what they were like as a married couple, and they really, as I write, I've just, kind of put my 9th book in the can for the editors at the publishing house to start picking at. And I'm already thinking about the next one. And I'm really enjoying the relationship between Lane and Darling quite a bit. So this was an opportunity for me to explore more of that. The community I write about, if you're not familiar with, is really just it's up and down the lake between Nelson and Caslow, on what I think is called Highway 6 now. That's funny, I can't think of that. And sometimes veers over into New Denver. So we've had trouble in all those places so far in my books. And the community is the reflection of a real community that I lived in when I was a tiny child, that was quite near Balfour, 3 miles from Balfour, which is now where the ferry comes in, the big cross Kootenay Lake ferry. And the house that Lane Winslow lives in is, in fact, the house I lived in as a very small child, that my mother bought and loved her whole entire life. She never got over that house. The house haunted my entire existence, and we moved all over the place. I spent much of my childhood in Mexico and all of my high school and college in the United States before I came back to Canada. And, that house was still thrumming away in her head up until the day she died. So when I started writing the books, I thought about someone like my mother, only a bit younger, not married, no children, buying that house and how important that was to her. So it becomes a real, when they got married, I struggled a bit. Is like Lane going to leave her house and move to Nelson, and there was just no way. So that's what I did. And, there were a couple of men who commuted into town in my childhood from there. So I felt it was okay to do that. So that's kind of the background to this book, a little bit about the geography. And maybe at this point, we should, have you got any questions out there, JP?
Well, I'd like to invite anyone listening in whatever channel, either Zoom here on Zoom or on YouTube or Facebook, to submit some questions. I have a question or two for you, if I may, Iona.
Yeah.
One of the things that you said was that you were interested in seeing what these two were like as a married couple. So that suggests to me that the writing process for you is your characters have a life of their own. And that it's kind of an exploratory process, and the characters come alive to you as you're writing. Can you talk about that a little bit, how that works?
I can, for anyone out there who's writing. And by the way, can I just interject that though I took my writing degree in my 40s, when I was already much older than all the people in the master's program, I didn't begin writing these books till I was 64. So you need never worry about time rushing by. You can always start. Yes, for me, it is really an exploratory process. So what happens when I sit down to write every day is I really, for the most part, have no idea what's going to happen. And the advantage of that for me is I'm not someone who plots all the books in advance. I don't. I write a whole bunch, maybe get halfway, 3/4 of the way through the book before I begin to think, okay, I'm going to need to weave these things together. They are, after all, murder mysteries. And, there are certain obligations you have to the reader. But for me, starting so late in life as a writer, or a writer of adult books, it wouldn't suit me to write like that, to be just stringing plot points together with my daily write. That's not something that interests me. What really interests me is the creative process of what happens when I sit down in front of my computer and really don't know what's going to happen. I've never been abandoned by the muse or whatever it is. I just start writing, and sooner or later things come together. Sometimes I'll read the last bit and I'll go, okay, this is something that the readers will need to know right now. And so I'll start writing a scene, maybe involving one of the characters, maybe involving the history of one of the characters in the past. And so that's what happens. I start writing, Lane says something, then Darling says something, and then, Lane says something back. And I can look back at it later and kind of go, wow, I can't believe I actually, that's actually what happened, kind of thing, right? And it's interesting, if I ever do something false, and I had a false moment in my previous book, where Lane was going to maybe tell a white lie to Darling. And I couldn't let it sit. She would just never do that. That's not who she is. I might do it. You might do it. Other people might do it. She wouldn't. And, she's had too much in her life that would forbid her from doing that. So I would then change that and make that more true, if you see what I'm saying.
Well, I find that interesting too, because it may sort of go against what many people think that writers of mystery books would normally do, which is plot everything out. But I'd love to know what attracted you to mystery, and why was that the sort of thing you ended up spending the most time on?
Well, some very obvious reasons are that I love to read mysteries, and I love to read mystery series. On a deeper level, what I really enjoy about mysteries is that you're seeing people in extremis. You know, you're seeing them up against the wall. You're seeing them in difficult situations where they have to make difficult decisions, sometimes very wrong ones. And that interests me quite a bit. I would never have said that I was interested in the 1940s. I do read lots of historical mysteries because I enjoy them. They're certainly an escape. But once I started writing the 1940s, I became really interested in that. And what I was, beginning to think about is these are the conditions. You know, the war is just over. People are coming back. Women are, being shunted out of their jobs sometimes. All of that goes on. There's quite a bit of that in a lot of the books. That's where characters are having their difficulties sometimes. And I just wanted to think about, people's actual lives in those situations, like to go there and be in those situations. And, you tack onto that a murder, and you're really exploring all kinds of human dynamics, and I think the idea of murders is the reason we like to read murder mysteries is because in the stories, the mystery gets resolved, justice is done, unless you're Donna Leone and she's writing about the Italian police and it seems like justice is never done. But more or less, there's some closure there. But I'm also aware that, once someone's life has been taken, something's been taken off the planet, really. There is a loss there that never gets quite repaired. So that's all the stuff that really interests me about writing mysteries.
I want to ask too about your background as a teacher, which I imagine, and please tell me if this is incorrect, supplied you with a lot of ideas about human characters or human character traits, but also just as an add-on question there, does it limit you in terms of names? Because I know a lot of teachers who actually have associations with so many different names. Does it make it harder to name characters?
Well, the funny thing about my very first book, which I self-published at first, because I didn't even try to get a publisher. I just assumed no one would want to publish my books, and so I spent a good deal of coin getting it published. And I was very surprised by the popularity of it among the people who were reading it. And my local bookstore kept calling me and saying, we need 10 more books, we need 10 more books. And so that was when I began to think about maybe I should try to find a publisher, though I was just exhausted ahead of time by the idea of how I was going to do that. And then I just had a stroke of luck, and somebody who knew a publisher read the book. That publisher doesn't do this type of work, but he knew someone else who did, and that was Touchwood, and they phoned me months later, asked for this book and the whatever I'd done on the second book, and called me again many months later and said, we'd like to offer you a contract for both books. And I just about fell down dead. I was so excited. Anyway, that first book went to the editor, and I did get a note from the editor saying, you have 5 characters named Adam. And I realized that I was going to have to be a lot more scrupulous in finding names. In answer to your first question, I think teaching, before I was a teacher, I was a youth worker, and I was working with quite troubled kids who came from very, very unhappy and difficult backgrounds often. And, that really taught me, those years, I think, taught me what I needed to know. Those years helped me enormously. when I was a teacher, because I came into the classroom with a lot of understanding and a lot of empathy for where some of the kids were coming from. And I taught in East Vancouver schools, and at that time there tended to be more poverty there, and so on and so forth. So you know, that has certainly really informed the books I've written that have children in them. So my third book is called An Old Cold Grave. And, you know, some of the thing centers on the home children, which is another very big Canadian story. And but there's also a teenager in there who's being rebellious, and Nelson, and a teenage girl, and I like her quite a bit, and she definitely comes from my time of working with kids and of teaching. So yes, I guess, you know, and certainly my teaching helped me to go into this one-room schoolhouse, because Lane has to go in there as a teacher on call, as it were. One of my colleagues, a retired colleague, wrote on Facebook, "Oh goody, a book about a teacher on call." And you know, it's all new to her. It was really fun to go into the classroom and just have it be all new to her, you know, what she would have to do, you know, but she's an educated woman, so she's not entirely without resources. But this is such a strange and unfamiliar situation for her. But she has, as it turns out, a lot of empathy for the children.
That's so interesting. And you know, one of the other things that you've talked about, and that's apparent from your sort of biography, is that you've done a lot of your writing sort of after retiring from teaching. Is that correct? So
right.
Did you always know that did you imagine being at this point in your career and having those books on your shelf? And what's your advice to people who may be working a day job, but wanting to write on the side and looking forward to something like you're doing now?
Well, my story about that is my mother was a writer. And this character, by the way, is inspired certainly in lots of ways by my mother. She's much more sensible and less risk-takey than my mother was, but you know, in lots of ways they have crossovers. You know, I felt haunted by writing when I was a child. I mean, you know, I was born in 1948, and you know, nobody in the whole time I was growing up ever knew where their children were. You know, they'd leave the house in the morning, and they'd come back when they needed food, basically, and you never knew where they were. And I'd always leave the house because my mother was typing, and you know, it was click, 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 click the whole time. And I just thought, you know, she's not going to pay any attention to me anyway. I'm going off to, you know, play on the railway. And in the mine tailings, I'm not making that up. This was in a mine in Zacatecas, where we lived in Fresnillo, because my father was a mining geologist, and so we lived in all these different places. So I think I got the bug then that I would be a writer. And I decided that, you know, when my mother was in her 70s, she took a master's degree in writing from UBC. And I thought, damn, if she can do it, what the heck, I'm only 40 something, I'm going to go do that now. And I happened to have written a children's book, which never saw the light of day, sort of a grade 8 time travel mystery thing that I tried to get published the very same year the first Harry Potter book came out. Oh gosh. And that was enough to get me into the program, into the master's program. So that's what I did. And then after that, I was busy working, and I always had in the back of my mind, I want to write, I want to write, I want to write. And, you know, aside from my children's book, thank you for being delighted by the name, Henry and the Cow Problem, I really, you know, I published some poetry and some short fiction, like you do if you're a graduate of the UBC program. And, you know, I really felt haunted by that as well. You know, I would look at my friends who didn't want to write and think how lovely and carefree they were, because they never had it in the back of their mind that they really should be writing. They should be writing. And I think, you know, I really hit the wall 2 years before I was going to retire. I was reading one of those brochures about what you should do if you're going to retire. And it said, a lot of people think they're going to write a book when they retire. you're not going to write a book. So don't even think it. Just put that out of your mind. And I thought, oh my God, if I'm going to write, I'm going to have to start now, because if I go to my retirement, then it's going to be, you know, the next day, the next day, the next day, and it might never happen. So that's really how the first book got started. And at that time, I can tell you, I absolutely would swear to you on a stack of anything you like that I could never write an entire grown-up book. I'd never done it, and I knew I never could. And what happened was, I thought, I'll get up at 5 o'clock every morning, because I had to be at school at 7 because I was the principal, and I would write 400 words. And so every morning I wrote 400 words. I didn't even think about where they were going. And my very first, all the things that I learned about myself as a writer, I learned during that period in the first books. That first book in particular. So I would get up the next morning, read my 400 words and think, oh, well, maybe this should happen now. And I'd write my next 400 words. And that went on until I had 80,000 words. And by the time I retired, I had named the book something else. We won't say what it was, my self-published book. They could talk about it at my retirement party, that I had this book that I was going to publish, kind of thing, right? So that's how I managed to do it. I was absolutely gobsmacked that I got through and wrote an entire book. Absolutely amazed. And once I'd written that one, I thought, I have this other idea. And my ideas always start with this image. And the image in the first book was this young, beautiful, multilingual, retired spy, goes to the ends of the earth in Kootenay Lake area and sees this house and buys it. And I had this vision of her standing in the front door of the house thinking, oh my God, this is mine. And that was what started that book off. And for the second book, there's a hot springs near there called Ainsworth. I changed the name to protect poor little Ainsworth, which really only now is the hotel in the hot springs. And I imagined a Russian dying in that hot spring. And so that was it. I was off to the races. And that became the pattern. Every single book has that same kind of, there's the image, and now I'm going to write.
And I'm curious too, when you write, do you have an audience in mind or an ideal reader? I know some people are writing for a particular person, and then it works out that many people love it. But do you have a reader in mind?
I assume the reader would be mostly women like myself who love mysteries. I have been absolutely amazed and delighted by the number of men who've been enjoying the books and who send me letters about them. So that's been a really, really big surprise for me. I've really enjoyed that. And, there's a tension for me between a kind of spy genre, like occurs in a couple of the books, and just the plain old mystery genre, the historical mystery genre, which will continue, I think. I've seen things I don't often read Goodreads very much, but I did see recently that they'd read book number 4, and it involves spies. They didn't like it as much as the other ones. And then other people who really love spies really liked that book almost more than all the others, kind of thing. So I'm always going back and forth because it's another genre that I really love. And I don't know if that's in your, whatever you're feeding off about my background, but my mother was herself in intelligence, and my grandfather absolutely was a spy. And he spied probably prior to the First World War, through it, after it, right up until 1943, when he was finally caught by the Germans in Latvia, who arrested him and basically murdered him. So, he was the real deal. And I just have to tell one very short story, if I may. I recently got a letter from the head, just now because, the Euro soccer matches are on and Copa America is on. I'm a huge soccer fan. I got a letter from the Latvian Soccer Federation apologizing to me that they did not know that my grandfather had descendants. And the reason that's important is because my grandfather is the father of Latvian football. And it's the 100th year since the establishment of the Latvian Football Federation, and they want to honor him. And so the guy said, I really didn't know that much about him. I went, online and looked him up, and all I could find was that he was a spy. But he also found for me, because my mother didn't get along with her father at all, and she never really told me much about him. And we lived away from England, so I never really met my English relations until I was a grown-up. She never told me that he had brothers, and one of his brothers was in MI6 as well. So, there's more than just the two spies in my family, it turns out. So that's why I think I like that genre as well a little bit.
And so how do you get information, either, the family history, information about your grandfather, or how do you, because you write about a period in history, do you do a lot of research to do that? And how do you create the sort of and recreate the environment?
I have to admit, I'm a poacher, and I poach whatever I have from my family, any family stories. So whatever my mother told me, I poach that, and put it in my books, because it's, I fictionalize it, but it's still, it comes from a real place. And, when I wrote the second book, and I had someone assigned to assassinate the Russian who died in the hot springs, I thought I was pushing the envelope a little bit. Like, I knew Stalin sent people abroad to kill people, because I happened to be a friend of the great granddaughter of Trotsky. And we know Stalin sent someone to kill Trotsky all the way to Mexico. So I didn't think that was too far-fetched. But when I began to research Russians in the 1940s in Canada and in Western Canada, they were everywhere. First of all, you had lots of Russian emigres coming, they'd gone to Shanghai, and then they were coming here, getting away from Bolshevism and communism. But you also had the place full of Russian spies all over the place. And they were very active in Canada, because by that time they were actively trying to get nuclear secrets. So that's stuff that I just look for in Google. The online stuff is absolutely amazing. For the book about the refugees, the Sudetenland refugees from Czechoslovakia, that involved learning about it online, and then finding a book in the library that was actually a memoir of one of them. And that was just absolutely brilliant to have on hand, because again, it's that business of, this is happening in your history right now. What is your life like if you're living in that period at that moment, and having a memoir like that is amazing. And same with the third book that dealt with the home children. There was a wonderful book written by a social worker in 1975 that was all just interviews with home children. So, in that sense, I balance the two, I guess. And then if I want, like right now, I'm writing a book that's involved me having to go up to the Kootenays to do actual research and meet people, because I have a bit of a First Nation theme in the next book. So.
Can you tell us more about the next book, or is that, some people don't like talking about their next work or the work in progress, and I totally respect that, but.
Well, there's a lot of stuff outside of that, first book it involves a Sinaiks person from the Kootenay area. So I think because I'm still in the middle of kind of working on it, I want to just leave it. But lots of crazy stuff is happening in Nelson. I can tell you that.
Okay.
And Ames is, you know, girlfriends. Constable Terrell has got a motorcycle, you know, which, by the way, Constable Terrell's motorcycle came to me via a gentleman in Manitoba who's an expert on vintage motorcycles. And he wrote to me and said, you've got to put one of your people on a vintage motorcycle and I will help you. And sure enough, we got to get together and did that. So that's another example of, you know, getting incredibly interesting, useful feedback from readers.
Oh, that's great. Can I ask you a little bit about your writing habits and writing life? You mentioned that, you know, when you first started out, you'd get up every morning before you had to go to school and you would write 400 words. Do you keep a fairly regular schedule, or what are your habits like as a writer?
I keep a very regular schedule. I basically keep a Monday to Friday schedule, and I write first thing in the morning. So typically I get up and I get my cup of tea. I might, you know, you always have to procrastinate before you start writing. So I thumb through the New York Times, which I get online, and look at this and that. And then I'll write. And I don't have a word count. Like the 400 words was really about, you have to write at least that much or it's just not going to count, right? And, you know, I'm a bit of a babbler, you may have figured it out. And so writing 400 words wasn't that difficult. But now, you know, 400 words would be an embarrassment. It would mean that the workmen were coming into the house and I have to leave or something, right? So I typically will try to make sure I get 1,000 words. And sometimes if it's going well and I'm on to something, that might stretch to 15 or 2,000 words. And then that's it. I have not as successfully moved the time, the workmen coming into the house, but they'll be gone in the afternoon. So I'll write in the afternoon and it just isn't as good. You know, whatever clever things come to me, they tend to come to me in the morning, and I'm not judging them. And I think if I can say, if there are other writers out there, you know, one of my hard and fast rules about writing is never to, you'd call it a race. Like, don't write something and think, oh my God, that's so dumb, and then track it out, and then try to write something else. I never do that on that day. I just write, I write, and I think, oh God, that's dumb, but I keep writing. And then I won't make any judgment about what I've written until I looked at it the next day. And that's really important because you can lose really important stuff if you just think, and you don't know why you're thinking that's dumb, because it's not like something, you know, on any given day, it could be because it's not like something somebody else did that you admire as a writer or whatever. So you can't make a judgment while you're writing. You can only make it afterwards. And that's when I've discovered some quite clever things I've written, you know, that I thought were dumb at the time I was writing them. This isn't going to fly, right. But then the next day I'm like, wow, I can't believe I wrote that, right? And it puts a lot of, the other thing, the not plotting thing, if you're writing mysteries, can be a difficulty because I'll often start with a corpse. And then I have no idea who the corpse is, how he got there, he or she, whoever it is. You know, I know nothing about it, and I can only know by writing. And I actually had a rule when I taught I taught my kids in school. You don't know what you think until you write. Because, you know, as soon as you say, can you write something in your journal? Here are some topics, or pick one of your own. They immediately cry, but I can't think of anything. And that's when I came up with the idea, you don't know what you think until you write. And that really is actually true. So that's how I discover things at the same time, practically, as Lane and the police do.
And then how about, I mean, you've mentioned that you go back to and read something the next day. Can you talk about your editing process a little bit, and what does that look like?
I'll usually write all the way through. And when I'm rereading, I pick up things and I change them. So, you know, if I'm rereading a big section from yesterday, I'll pick up things that I'll go, no, I really don't like that. I'm going to do this with that instead, or change it, or fix a typo, or whatever it is. But I'm still very focused on getting to the end of the book. That's important to me, you know. And sometimes I've actually stopped and you know, I work on a program called Scrivener. So I'll go to Word and I'll write out ideas. Okay, this is what's happened so far. This could be what happens next, kind of thing, right? And then that's just a place to dump ideas. It's a place to stimulate thinking. I'm not even taking those ideas back. They're just things that I've deposited there, and I know my brain will do the work, so that when I go back to sit down, it'll already be there, or it'll be coming out, kind of thing. I can't even remember what your question was. Oh, the editing process. So then when I've done the whole book, that's when I'll go through and read it. And I'll read it to myself like you do. And I'll start to worry about, have I said something too early? Have I had this character do something that's out of character? I start to do those things. And then I have, I think they're called beta readers, people who read the book for you. So I have a college friend who's an extraordinarily good beta reader. Like, she not only picks up errors, but she picks up things like, this one really got me, but it's actually true. I had a character saying, one of the police probably saying, "I'm going to need you to do such and such." And she fired back to me, "That is modern speak. No one talked like that in those days." This kind of talk started probably in the 70s or the 80s, kind of thing. And she picks up those things, right? And she also picks up language that I might have coming out of someone's mouth, and she'd say, this doesn't sound like something Ames would say. Can you rephrase it? So that's incredibly useful as well. And then it goes to the editors, and then it's another 7 or 8 time process of them saying, unhelpfully, "Can you move this whole thing over to here?" And boy, when you have to move and I write in chunks, right? But if I have to move a whole thing somewhere else, an extraordinary amount of work has to be done after it and before it to repair that, but it's usually a very, very good call on their part.
I know, Iona, that you've written several books in this series, and I have to imagine, though correct me if I'm wrong, that you have a personal favorite. Do you have a personal favorite in the series? Why is it your favorite?
It's like all your children. They're all different. For a long time, my personal favorite was the second one, because, I think it freed me from it began to open up possibilities for who Lane was and what was going to happen, and who Constable Ames then, and the Inspector Darling were going to be. And I loved the Russian theme in it. When I was a child, my mother spoke absolutely flawless Russian, flawless German, flawless French. And she, had her very best friend was Russian, and her other best friend was the one who is Angela in my books, the American. And so I heard Russian around a lot in the house. And it intrigued me. I studied Russian in college, and with that, I studied a lot of Russian, especially modern Russian history, just prior to the revolution and beyond that. And it was just fun to be able to use that stuff, right? So I'm going to be doing a talk for the Vancouver Public Library. I do one talk a month on one of my books. And this month, the seventh book, no, I beg your pardon, the 6th book is called A Deceptive Devotion. And that is very heavily concerned with spies. And she meets up with her old spy acquaintance, the Russian spy, who used to work with her father, that we met in book 2. So I was able to bring him back, and both in book 4, which I also really loved, because in book 4, Lane Winslow has to Save Darling. And, I literally started with, well, I'm just going to write a book about how Lane Winslow saves Darling. And the problem is going to have to be in England, because that's where she's got all the resources, and she knows people and she knows things. And so that's what I did. And so that's another big favorite of mine. And, the one I'm going to talk about next week is also Deceptive Devotion, a big favorite, because I used a lot of the Russian history that I learned in school.
Fascinating. In terms of favorites, what are your favorite things to read, and what are you currently reading? I imagine that you read a lot.
I do, though I do not read as much as I did before I started writing, interestingly. I'm a little bit, I didn't realize this until after I retired, but I'm a little teensy weensy bit A-type. And it's very hard for me to go, okay, now I'm going to sit here and get my cup of tea and just read. And that's something I just have to learn to do, I think. But I never read the Harry Potter books, so I'm finishing up right now. I'm on the last one. I love 19th century literature, and I read it and reread it and reread it. So Dickens and Austen are huge favorites of mine. And you've got mystery galore there, human situations, especially in Dickens, who, by the way, introduced one of the very first detectives, Inspector Bucket, he was called. Wonderful character. And I'm also reading a book by Horowitz, who produced the show about the detective in World War II in Hastings. It'll come to me. Foyle's War, who's a wonderful writer and historian, and he's written a mystery book, which I'm reading right now, called The Magpie Murders, I think. And I often have to read books for things that I'm doing. So, for example, I just read 2 types of mysteries that I might not normally read, one by J.A. Jance and the other one by Linda Gardner, who writes kind of gruesome, dark thrillers, because I was moderating a discussion for the Tucson Festival of Books with the 2 of them. So I would read those books to be, au courant with what they're doing.
Can I get your opinion on reading and books in general, sort of? And you worked as an educator, so certainly you saw children and how perhaps their leisure activities and pastimes change. Do you think reading is on the decline, or is it as strong as ever? Do you have a sense of that?
I'm gonna posit that it's as strong as ever. And the reason is that in the past, fewer people were educated, but they all read. You know what I'm saying? And now education is absolutely universal, or certainly we hope it to be. And what I found as a teacher, that I always had a cadre of passionate book readers among the kids. And I bet you that percentage of passionate book readers was equal to any time in history. Because there's a segment of the population that absolutely loves reading and loves reading novels. And I must say, credit J.K. Rowling for inspiring reading in kids. Absolutely massive. And 21? So back in 2018, I was at the Tucson Festival of Books, and I was so thrilled to notice that it's a massive festival with 300,000 people attending, and all of the authors, YA authors for kids and for kids younger, had massive lineups of kids wanting to get into their talks. So that was, I think that's the case. And then the other thing I think I had to let go of as an English teacher in particular, because my mantra is read novels, and there's reasons why they're good for you, because you have to carry a lot of information in your brain. And while you're reading, you're doing an incredible amount of calculus, like what's going to happen here? Who is this? I bet it's that, you do all of this while you're reading. And it is known to be very, very good for you're thinking. And it is the readers who typically, and I think data-wise, do the best in school, for sure. So I encourage it, but I had to let go of the idea that that's the only kind of reading there can be. I have two grandsons. One of them is, just finishing up his third year at university. The other one just graduated from high school, and they never loved reading, but they read tons of other stuff. My just graduated grandson just loves, details about language and how they formed and things like that, so he reads other stuff. So, I feel like we need to let go of the idea of despair about people reading. Sure. And certainly through COVID, it's been very good for the written arts, I must say.
Well, and speaking of COVID, and you mentioned the Tucson Festival and such, how do you feel about doing these events by Zoom? Does this give us access to more people? Or are you keen to go back to the in-person? How do you feel about this, the engagement and virtual and in-person and that?
I like a mix. I really enjoy in-person events very, very much. All of my book launches until this year. Oh no, I've had 2 book launches last spring and this spring that were Zoom. And what was nice about them is Carrie Claire from Ontario could join me, and there were people joining in from everywhere, which was fantastic. And same with this one, the author Ian Hamilton was kind enough to come and join me for my book launch. And so that makes it very accessible, which I really like, but I also like the energy of in-person events. I just really do. There's something very nice. I'm much more amusing when I'm talking to people, I think, than I am when I'm talking to, the screen sort of thing.
Well, I found you, Iona, very engaging, so you don't have to think about that at all. I'd like to make sure that everybody knows where they can find your books, how to buy your books, how to support you as an author, how to find out more about you. Where should they go?
My website is very informative. It has all the books, what they're about. And that's ionawhishaw.com. So you see my name on the screen there, ionawhishaw.com. And they certainly are, they should be, I'm assuming they should be available in your local bookstore. If not, I'm sure you can ask for them. Kindle, Kobo, they're all on ebook format. And just recently we have the first 6 books produced as audiobooks by a wonderful British actress who works in Toronto reading them. And she's very popular with the people who listen to them. So those are quite enjoyable if you'd like to take in your literature while you're going for your walk.
Yeah, that's super. And can you talk just a little bit about the importance of supporting our local writers? We try very much to feature local writers in our author talks because we think it's important to support local. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Well, I mean, the first and number one reason is that your local writers are absolutely phenomenal. There's, in my particular genre, there's an amazing number of fantastic writers, and you just wish that they could have more, that more people would read them. Because they're absolutely amazing. And I learned this because, I've been to events. There's a number of mystery writers. There's 2 mystery writers, probably more, and I apologize if I've left anyone out, working out of Nelson, writing mysteries about that part of the wood, for example. And there's a wonderful guy called Dave Butler who writes about a woman who stops people from poaching wild animals, in BC. And there's fantastic, a real host of fantastic writers here in Vancouver. And I think what's so great is to go into stores and see them there. And because I think that's the main thing, because they're writing about our home and they're fantastic writers. I just can't emphasize this enough. It's just such a pleasure to read their work. So I think, you're doing yourself a favor, really.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. We have a lot of writers in our audience and a lot of writers who tune in. I'd love to hear just some sort of final advice or words of encouragement for those who are writing, who can't necessarily do it full time, but have high hopes. What do you tell them?
I tell them the most important thing is to write, to carve out a little bit of time somewhere at a time that suits your creative style. As I said, for me, it's the morning. There's a wonderful writer called Kathy Ace who writes her books, in the middle of the night. I could never do that. So it's really, I think, just important to, and it doesn't matter how long. I mean, before, when I was really working hard and I was working on my children's book, I was back at work after taking a year off to get my master's. And, I was finding little 20 minutes here and 10 minutes there. It doesn't really matter. And I think the other thing is to not think there's a right way to do it. I think that's really, really important. I remember when I began to think about writing mysteries, I picked up a book on mystery writing and I ordered it and it came and I started to read it and I just put it away because there was nothing in it that felt like me. And it had all the instructions for what to do, how to plot, how to lay things out, how to develop characters, all of that kind of thing. I don't spend time writing on a separate piece of paper what all my characters are like, where they're born, where they went to school, what quibbles they have. I don't do that. I find that out as I'm working with them. And I put that in. So it's an accumulation of information about the characters that I'll carry through. So I think it's important to just write. There's no right way to do it. That I've definitely discovered. I'm very different from others and others are very different from me. And courage, don't you know?
No, that's great. That's really helpful advice, I think, that there's not one way to do it. I'd like to end with one maybe slightly more personal question. I guess, it looks like there's hope about a pandemic sort of ending. Someone told me yesterday there's light at the end of the tunnel and it's not a train. So is there something you're looking forward to this summer, Iona?
Well, I am, as a matter of fact. There's a little literary festival I'm looking forward to, which is up in Seashelt. They have a lovely little writers festival and they're going to run it in person this time. They've spread it out so that there's only 50 people at each event, but it's going to be in person. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to going to a cocktail bar, I think. Just have, and to see my favorite sports team play real, that would be nice. To see my grandson play, that would be very nice.
That sounds delightful. Not long before the pandemic hit, I had a nice time in the lounge of the Sylvia Hotel, and that's one of the first things I want to do when all of this is over and I get a chance to go to Vancouver. So I wish you the same. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for listening today. This has been so fascinating, Iona. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you, and so thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, I'd encourage everyone to visit Iona's website. We've put a link there in the chat if you're joining us from Zoom. If you're not on Zoom, then you can find her at ionawishaw.com. And please buy her books, support her amazing work, and give her a virtual round of applause. So thank you so much, Iona.
Thank you, JP. It was an enormous pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I will hand it back to our amazing partners at the library. Kevin.
Hello again. Thank you so much, JP, and thank you so much, Iona, for joining us today. That was really interesting for me as well, and I hope for our audience. Excuse me while I run off to find your books. Before we go, I just want to share a couple quick things, and then I will be ending the session. So we have a couple upcoming events. We have the Summer Reading Club that runs during the summer. Whether you're 5, 15, or 75, we have a summer reading club for you here at the library. So come in or check out our website at tnrl.ca to find out more. We also have on June 30th, nature photographer and storm chaser David Chapman joining us online for a celebration of International Asteroid Day. That's going to have an amazing presentation showcasing some of the incredible things that he has seen in his years and that he has photographed especially. And our final author talk is also coming up July 8th. That's with the screenwriter and author Rosalind Muir. And after many years as a successful screenwriter, Rosalind has recently released her first juvenile fiction novel, and I have to make sure I get this right. It's The Chimera's Apprentice. Rosalind will be speaking about the differences between these two genres and how she made the jump. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us this evening. And as always, if you have questions for the library, you can get in touch with us at questions@tnrd.ca, by phone at 250-372-5145, or send us a message on our Facebook page. Thank you and good night.
Good night.